Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing a mid-month reading wrap up for May, focusing on everything that I read for the readathon SpringAthon. So SpringAthon was a readathon that I hosted that was running from the 4th to the 17th of May that was focused on nature writing and natural history writing. So I've got the books that I read for that. I did read a few other books during the time, but I'm going to talk about them at the end of the month rather than in this wrap up. This wrap up is specifically about SpringAthon and the SpringAthon prompts. So there were 5 prompts for SpringAthon, all 1 word each, and across those 5 prompts I read 8 books and DNF'd 1. 2 of them were fiction, 6 were non-fiction, and I'm going to talk about all of them today. I'm going to go in order of prompts. So the first prompt I want to talk about very briefly is travel. For this I read Sea People by Christina Thompson. I will not be able to talk about my feelings for this one in this video, however, because it is for the BookTube Prize, so it'll be featured in my BookTube Prize wrap up coming out at the beginning of June once the judging for this round is over. Sea People puzzle of Polynesia, specifically looking at how the people of Polynesia got to the various islands and the various theories that there have been historically as to how they ended up there and evolved. So the next prompt I'm going to talk about is Animal. I read 2 books for Animal. The first one is Extraordinary Insects, Weird, Wonderful, Indispensable, The Ones Who Rule Our World by Sverdrup-Thygeson. I think I've done that right. So this is actually a translated fiction. This is a translated non-fiction, and it was translated by Lucy Moffat. This was originally written in Norwegian, which I had no idea going into it, but it's quite cool to have a translated non-fiction on the list. So as the title suggests, this is looking at the insect world in a lot more detail, covering what officially is an insect and then some of their funky, quirky adaptations for things like food, kind of parental care, sex in general, colonies, etc, etc. This was a fantastic read and I would 100% recommend it to anybody interested in it or kind of on the fence about it. It was surprisingly light to get through because actually I don't know whether you can see the margins are quite big, and there is the classic quite large chunk of index at the end, as you always get with any non-fiction, which means that despite it being a little bit bigger, it isn't actually that long in the grand scheme of things to read. I also think that Anne had a wonderful turn of phrase, a really lovely way of structuring the information, and a very, very light touch when it comes to her humour. I thought that this was just that perfect blend of like enough detail into various different areas that you feel like you're learning something with enough kind of throwaway facts that sort of are lovely little factoids that you can latch onto. I blitzed this in only a few days and absolutely loved it. I also thought the structuring was really well done given how broad of a topic insects in general is. Like if you really stop and think about it, the sheer amount of variety across the board in insects that actually, like if you're trying to talk meaningfully about hypothetically like mating practices in insects, well there's like a billion different things going on there. So how are you supposed to do that meaningfully in a book that isn't literally like the length of an encyclopedia? But I think Anne is like really clever with how she approaches it and is very good at cherry picking specific examples without it feeling just like a crazy scattergun approach. So I really respected and appreciated her craft and skill as a non-fiction writer. You can tell she's kind of in academia and is used to parting information in a meaningful way for an audience, and I think it's fantastic. Also, cover is stunning. I know I said it last time, but like this is a book you want on your shelf. The other book that I read for Animal was sadly a huge disappointment, and that is Incredible Journeys by David Barrie. This is exploring the wonders of animal navigation, although actually it should be in brackets, exploring the wonders of bird and insect navigation, because animals in terms of mammals are few and far between in this. Basically this book, if you compare the two, in some ways they would be quite similar because they're looking at quite a broad topic that it would be quite easy to do a scattergun approach for, but unfortunately where Anne has all the craft to be able to pull it off, David Barrie is lacking in that skill. I actually ended up giving this 2 stars on Goodreads because I disliked it so much. It was one of these ones where I very nearly DNF'd it, but it was tolerable enough that I didn't want to abandon it, but also wasn't actually enjoyable. This was one of the first books I started in SpringAthon, but it was also one of the last I finished. It took me a full 2 weeks to get through this, even though it was one of the shorter, if not the shortest, non-fiction book on the list. The issues here really come down to mainly a structural thing and also some weaknesses with the author himself personally. The book is structured loosely in terms of in chapters, but those chapters lack like clear headings or defined sort of boundaries as to what we're going to be talking about within that particular chapter. If I compare it to Extraordinary Insects, I can skim the contents page and know exactly what we're going to be talking about in each chapter. That one's on food, that one's on mating, that one's on parental care. Like it's clear as to what part of the insect we're going to be talking about. In this one, I had no idea what style of navigation. There was all sorts of discussions of things to do with navigating by the stars, the sun, there's magnetic poles, there's all sorts of different ways to be able to navigate, but this book bounced between them. We kept kind of looping backwards and forwards. We'd hang out with these ants and then we'd lose them and then we'd come back to them later. Like, there were constant references to the same like experiments that had been spread across different chapters. At one point we were learning about, I think it was bumblebees, and it was really cool. And then there was like a break literally right in the middle of talking about them for a random chapter break, and then the next chapter had a load of bit about lobsters crowbarred in at the end, which didn't seem to make any sense. And it was kind of, it almost felt like the author had arbitrarily been like, right, roughly every 10 to 15 pages chapter break, regardless of whether it's needed or not. Also, the book at the beginning says that it's going to be looking at the what and how rather than the why of this particular animal navigation, and I have two issues with this. First of all, the why in science is one of the most interesting, so why wouldn't you talk about the why? But also, I don't think he even goes as far as to the how. For the majority of this book, he's just talking about a variety of examples of animal navigation without really looking in depth at how the animals actually do what they're doing. And one of the issues with this is David Barrie isn't a scientist. He's actually somebody who works primarily in the arts and is also a sailor and just generally interested in the topic. Now, don't get me wrong, there are books out there that I've read that are written about science by non-scientists that can be fantastic, but the lack of structure at the top made this suffer. And it was really clear that he didn't really know what he was talking about. Huge sections of the book refer to things about how humans navigate and like references to sailors, which makes sense when you find out that David Barrie is a sailor and his other first book is called Sextant and is about humans exploring the ocean. So it kind of raised the question of, like, in a book this short anyway, bearing in mind again the index at the end that's going to cut a chunk out of it, like, actually if we took out all the bits that definitely are in your other book or weren't interesting enough to be in your other books or in this one, I preface this by saying I haven't read his other book, I don't actually know. Like, I think this would be even shorter. Like, this one should have been stripped back, had more detail about some very specific cases, and then a couple of gentle ones, like, sort of lightly dusted in for a little bit of colour. Basically like Anne does in Extraordinary Insects. This book is not worth your time or your money. And you have to ask the question with something like this, like, why does a book like this exist? With non-fiction in particular, you've got to be thinking about who is your audience and what level of detail are they going to be looking for. Because let's face it, not every reader is going to be picking up a book on animal navigation. Like, let's assume that if you're coming to this book, you are interested enough in both science and biology that you're going to want a lot more detail than this book can give. So I don't understand who this book is for, because anybody who would want to pick this book up, like myself, is going to be bitterly disappointed at what's actually in it. This just felt like a cash grab from the author, who had medium success with Sextant, and his publisher probably said, knock out another one, will you, mate? Like, waste of time. So that was, sorry. Let's move swiftly on, shall we? I read one book for plants and DNF'd one. Oh god, we're gonna get grumpy again. Let's talk about the nice one in between, shall we? The book that I finished is one of the fiction books I read. This is Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. John Wyndham is a classic sci-fi writer who was writing around the time of the 50s, and this is an absolutely fantastic book. It is actually one of his weakest that I've read so far, but that is like saying that, you know, oh, this chocolate is one of the least nice chocolates in this giant tray of chocolates. Like, they're all good, like, let's be honest. Day of the Triffids is probably one of his most famous, and it is a post-apocalyptic world right immediately afterwards, where a meteor strike has actually managed to blind the majority of the population, anybody who's outside at the time. As they've been blinded and they're stumbling around trying to resolve said blindness, the plant creatures called Triffids, who are kind of an established part of this universe, who are very large and can kind of crawl around on their roots, end up going and trying to do a takeover bid. The beginning half of this book was definitely weaker than the later half, because I personally thought that the slide into chaos and a complete like post-apocalyptic state kind of vibe happened alarmingly quickly, but it was in the 50s, so maybe like the infrastructure wasn't as strong, I'm not too sure, but that was probably the least believable part of it. But once we really settled into the kind of like survivalist style book, it really picked up. I really enjoyed the characters, I thought they were good fun, there was some interesting discussions about gender roles, and then once the Triffids really started to like rip their roots up and come for people, I really enjoyed that too. I've been saying on this channel for a couple of videos now that this is book 1 of 2, both written by John Wyndham, where we have the Night of the Triffids. Turns out I've been straight up lying to you guys, I'm so sorry. Night of the Triffids was actually written by Steve somebody and is a modern continuation of the story, because the story does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, a slightly dissatisfying ending, another reason why it's not one of my favourite Wyndhams out there. So an author took it upon himself to write the next kind of set of the book, which is the humans' war with the Triffids more directly. I do really want to go and read that, but it's not written by Wyndham, so apologies in past videos where I have said that Wyndham wrote both of them. It's not. I will put the cover here for the other one. The book that I DNF'd is The Cabaret of Plants, Botany and the Imagination by Richard Mabey. This one, I do think that there is an audience out there for here, unlike Incredible Journeys that no one should waste their time with. This book, if you are really into very flowery, pun not intended prose, or you're really looking for the symbolism behind plants and our interactions with them from more of a cultural, religious and kind of art-based context, kind of art history vibe, I think this book will really suit you. And if you do like I said, that almost flowery kind of purple prose style, this book will definitely suit you. For me personally, going into it, the book was just too overwritten and I didn't particularly enjoy Richard Mabey's writing style, and I was really hoping for more science and less humanities, basically. It's the kind of thing I've decided to DNF it because I was reading it at the exact same time as Incredible Journeys, and I couldn't handle two books at the same time that I was trying to like slog my way through. So unfortunately this one has suffered because of that direct comparison, and I think had I read it not in a SpringAthon focused on nature writing and just generally in my reading, I might have been more willing to chip away at it over the course of like a month or two, because each of the sections looks at a very particular plant and is probably only around 10 pages long. But for me right now it just felt very disjointed and, like I said, overwritten. It wasn't really, I just wasn't vibing with it, and I don't have the energy to do that and chip away at this one, so I've just decided to leave it alone. Life is too short to do that, personally. So I wouldn't say, if you were interested in this from me talking about it before, I wouldn't immediately write it off because I've DNF'd it. I do think that there is an audience for this one, but it's just not me. We're next going to talk about birds, and don't worry, from this point on all the books are mwah, chef's kisses all around. Everyone's very happy. One of my all-time favourites ever now, of course it's going to be, is Dinosaurs Without Bones by Anthony J. Martin. In typical fashion, I referred to Dinosaurs for the birds prompt for both of my books that I read, because of course I did. That's what I'm going to read on this channel. So this is looking at trace fossils and what we can gather from fossils left behind that aren't specifically dinosaur bones. So it's looking at things like footprints and various trace markings like that, as well as damage on the bones that happened from other creatures, whether it be like breaks or teeth marks or things like that. Apologies, my phone's buzzing in the background. But also it contains things like stomach contents, their fecal matter, and in some cases dinosaur vomit. Anthony J. Martin has a fantastic writing style. He is so funny. There's so much like dad humour in this book. It's amazing. But I am going to say, if you don't have a background in reading about dinosaurs already, do not pick this book up. It is not an intro level book to dinosaurs. If I say theropod and sauropod and you've no idea what I'm on about, don't pick this book up, okay? There's a pre-assumed amount of knowledge, both in terms of like technical jargon and just general history of like where the dinosaurs lived in terms of time frames and all sorts of things like that. Some basic dinosaur species knowledge would be helpful. However, if you are someone who's already read something like Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, watched a lot on YouTube, anything like that, and you're relatively comfortable with the terms, I would say definitely give it a go. Like, pick it up. It is so unbelievably fascinating. The amount that we can learn about how the animals lived from trace fossils is unbelievably cool. Like, just so many of the chapters were so unbelievably cool. There's a whole one about like a quarry and the different ways that we've understood what happened in this quarry based on like different theories and the different scientific principles and like apparatus that we have available to us over the course of like several decades from the original discovery to now, and the different ideas that we have. It's just so unbelievably fascinating and fantastic. Anthony J. Martin is a wonderful writer, but like I said, you have to know a little bit about what he's talking about before you attempt this book. The next one I read for bird was The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I actually read this on audiobook, and this is the second fiction that I read for SpringAthon as a whole. This is the author of Sherlock Holmes, but this is one of his adventure series. It's the Professor Challenger series, I believe, and this is book one of them. Basically, Professor Challenger has discovered a lost world, as the title suggests, that has been like closed off from the rest of the world, and so because of that, dinosaurs still live on it, and then also evolution has done some different freaky things. However, none of his science buddies believe him, so him and a bunch of people go off on an expedition to get more proof for them, and it's about their journey. In typical, because it is, again, it's a classic, it was written in, I believe, the Victorian era, you've got that framework of putting it in the form of letters back from one of the people on the expedition back to his editor, because he's a journalist, and you've got him like narrating to the reader style story to give it that framework framework, so there is that natural kind of like bit of fluff either side to justify why we'd be hearing about this story in the first place. It's a feature of the time. I don't think it adds anything to the book, but it also doesn't take away from it. Also, please bearing in mind, it is a product of its time, and it does get rather racist in places. It's not a major component of the book, and it's something that you can, depending on what your threshold for that kind of thing is, ignore and look past, because it is a product of its time, but it is a bit awkward in places. The term half-breed is bandied around a few times, so just be aware of that going in. Everybody as a reader has their own particular threshold for it. Okay, and then the last two books I want to talk about are some of my favourites actually as well, so maybe I've done this video in the wrong order. So we've now got Water to talk about, and I read 2 books for that. One of them I read was Waterfalls of Star by Rosanne Alexander, My 10 Years on the Island of Skoma, and this is a new all-time favourite non-fiction, maybe favourite book ever. So freaking good, so beautiful, everything I wanted from it. This is the true story of Rosanne Alexander, who went and lived on the island of Skoma, which is an island just off the coast of Wales, which has got a huge seabird population that is kind of basically part of conservation, and somebody has to live on the island. So she lived there with her husband. They hadn't been dating for very long when he got the job offer. They had to be married, so they married very quickly, and then she ended up spending 10 years with him on this island in almost total isolation. Absolutely fantastic read. Because it is a memoir, if you're looking for a hell of a lot of structure to this one, you're not going to find it. The years on Skoma are punctuated by the changing of the seasons, the storms, and then the odd event, but there isn't really a sense of like storyline or plot. We're just hanging out with her on this stunning island, listening to descriptions of puffins and seals and the heather and all the very pretty stuff, and it's just absolutely beautiful, but it's not like a page turner. There's no plot to speak of particularly. Also, because it is a memoir, there are a few points where, and this is something actually both the books I read for Water are a memoir, and I'm going to talk about a bit more with one of the other books in a second, but there are definitely points where you kind of wish she would expand on certain areas, and she doesn't, because basically she's not interested in that part. So there are some people who are working on the island who are looking into conservation and doing various kind of scientific experiments and things, lots of kind of recordings and observations of the animals and the kind of plant life, and we don't really find out anything about their work because she's not interested. That's not her thing, and this is her story. So if you just get a description of another storm, well, that's her story. But honestly, I thought it was such a peaceful, soothing, wonderful read, and I was a bit unsure in the current climate how I'd feel about like reading about somebody's isolation, but honestly it was so lovely and soothing to read, so I would recommend this to literally anybody. It's so stunning. And then the last book I want to talk about is Into the Planet, My Life as a Cave Diver by Jill Heinerth. I listened to this on audiobook and it is fantastic on audiobook. Definitely go check it out. This is a solid memoir about a woman who is a cave diver, which is, as you can imagine, horrendously dangerous, and she's making sure that you are aware of it the entire time. Like with Rosanne's book, the act of it being a memoir means that there are certain areas where we find out more information and certain areas where we find out less, that potentially I would change things around. But I think that's something you just have to accept going into a memoir, is it's the author's decisions on what is interesting rather than what you would necessarily want to know about more. So this details Jill's life, learning kind of her first interactions with scuba diving and cave diving in general, learning how to do more, meeting her husband who's also a cave diver, who then becomes her ex-husband, and you get to see that whole relationship unfold, and her really growing as a person and as a career woman within cave diving, trying to gain respect as a legitimate cave diver in an industry dominated by men, and also some of her exploits doing things like big dramatic cave dives in the Antarctic into icebergs, and she had some of the records for like some of the longest dives and the deepest dives and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. Ridiculously cool, but if you are going for this book thinking like, oh, there'll be loads of pretty descriptions of underwater scenery, nah, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Jill really focuses on the technical side of diving, so you get to learn a lot about scuba diving and all sorts of the kind of equipment involved with cave diving and underwater apparatus in general. Also, you get to learn a lot about the various people who have died doing it, so just be aware of that going in. Some fairly intense scenes and a lot more of the science behind what's happening. There were a few points where I really wish that there was more information. For example, she talked about working on a film set for the movie The Cave and talking about doing some of the stunt diving for that, but it really, when I said talking about it, I mean literally mentioned it briefly in a paragraph and just moved on, and I would have loved more information about that particular dive. but she was focused on other things. Because again, it's her life and her decision as to what she's going to include in the book. Also, her husband, you know, not to try and take sides or anything like that, but like was a massive dick to her at times, and I don't feel like she got the opportunity to really talk about what that meant. She's now on good terms with her ex-husband, and so the moments where he was a bit of a twat, it kind of, she's pulled back a bit from the emotion from that, and that was a little frustrating. At one point she gets the bends, which is where the nitrogen bubbles in your blood and like in your body basically kind of fizz up a bit. It's very painful, and in some cases can like be like, can kill you or can end a career because you can be partially paralyzed. And she has the bends and tries to like talk to him about it, and she tries to keep it from him for a bit and then tries to like go for him for help, and he literally says, no shit, what do you want me to do about it? Which, you're her life partner and as well as her dive partner, and she's potentially gonna like die. Could you not be a dick? That really got under my skin. But I do think it's a fantastic book, really fascinating, and if you're vaguely interested at all in the underwater world of cave diving, totally check it out. I think it's a wonderful intro into that world. So that's it from me. Those are all the books that I read for SpringAthon. I had such a good time with this readathon, and assuming that the interest is there, I would totally love to do it again. So if you took part and also really enjoyed it and would love to see it come back next year around the same time, please do let me know in the comments down below, because it would be really helpful to gauge people's interest for that kind of thing. It was really fascinating reading such a specific part of my non-fiction for such a period of time. Normally, as you'll know on this channel, I bounce around quite a lot, and I think a couple of the books might have suffered because of that, but I think it was the nice kind of line between reading too much of one area and like really towing that edge. But I also think I'm probably not going to pick up a crazy amount of nature writing for at least a few weeks, maybe a month, just to let my palette be cleansed a little bit more, because let's face it, I am an omnivore when it comes to reading, bit of a polymath. I like to read about all sorts of different things. So that's it from me. Have a wonderful reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye!